They say the earth remembers what we try to forget. But what if the land itself was complicit in hiding something that was never supposed to be found? In the spring of 1844, a farmer in central Virginia struck stone where there should have been soil. Beneath his plow was not rock, but the sealed entrance to a basement no one had seen in a decade. Behind that stone slab, rusted shackles, bone fragments, scraps of tiny shoes, and something worse, 37 iron rings in the wall, each stained by time and tears. This was not a cellar. It was a tomb designed for the living. You've heard the story they tell, the one about 1834, the official discovery, when the authorities raided the Sullivan farmhouse and freed 47 emaciated children from its underground labyrinth. But that's the version they let you hear. The real story didn't end in 1834. It didn't begin there either. It was just the chapter that got out. The basement in 1844 was a continuation, proof that the Sullivan operation didn't stop after discovery. It simply moved. What you're about to learn is dangerous, not because of what it says about the past, but because of what it reveals about the present, about how power operates in silence, about the way institutions rewrite horror into folklore, about the machinery behind every forgotten case in American history. This isn't just a story of one twisted family. It's about the systems that protected them and still do. So if you're expecting just another haunted house tale, you should stop watching now. This isn't for tourists of the macabre. This is for men who feel the pull of buried truths, who sense that what we were told about good and evil is a lie constructed by those who profit from obedience. Because in 1844, when they reopened the basement 10 years after the raid, the chains weren't empty. Not all the children were rescued, and Mother Sullivan had never acted. Ed alone, you were never supposed to know that, but you're here now, and once you see the whole picture, you will never see the world the same way again. The official records from 1834 tell a story of heroism. Sheriff Crawford and Deputy Webb, shocked by the horror beneath the Sullivan farmhouse, exposed the cruel imprisonment of 47 children. Newspapers called it a miracle rescue, but those same records go silent shortly after the arrests. No trial transcripts, no court documents, no burial records for the 36 dead. As if justice was performed in secret and sealed in silence, but the land never lies. A decade later, in 1844, when new owners of the Sullivan property attempted to build a root cellar near the barn, they unearthed what looked like a stone-lined pit, a shallow grave. They thought they'd uncovered an animal den until they found the bones, small bones, human, wrapped in cloth too delicate for adult use. Investigators were summoned quietly, and what they discovered next was buried so deeply in institutional secrecy that even the Virginia Historical Society refused to archive it. Underneath the barn was a second chamber, mirroring the layout of the original basement under the house, long since condemned. Same rings, same chains, but this time there was something new, symbols etched into the stone, not names, numbers, sequences, codified records, inventories. And then they found the journal. Not written by Ezra or Constant. This was authored by a man known only as R.M., a cleric from Baltimore who had visited the Sullivans under the guise of religious outreach. But what his journal revealed was chilling. The Sullivan children were part of an experiment, not just to break them, but to condition them, train them, prepare them. R.M. wrote of mental filtration, of testing obedience through isolation and deprivation, of categorizing children by their resistance thresholds, of selling the most malleable to unnamed buyers, not for labor, but for indoctrination. This wasn't just one mad couple with a taste for cruelty. It was a system. And those who pulled the strings never wore blood on their hands. They wore robes, sat in pews, handed out communion with one hand, and signed purchase orders with the other. The truth is, the Sullivans were never the masterminds. They were operators, caretakers, gatekeepers, And even in 1844, a full 10 years after the basement was supposedly shut down forever, there were still fresh footprints in the dirt, still small voices crying in the dark, still children missing. They called her Mother Sullivan, but the children didn't say it with affection. They whispered it like a curse, like the name of something that followed them even in dreams. What most people never understood is that Constance Sullivan wasn't just a woman. She was a role, an identity assumed, perfected, and passed on. You see, the Mother Sullivan who was arrested in 1834, that was not the same woman who ran the basement in 1844. The woman in custody died within weeks of her arrest. No trial, no confession. The official cause, consumption. But the physician who signed her death record, Dr. Whitfield, vanished shortly after. His home burned to the ground. His wife and children disappeared. No bodies were ever recovered. Just ash. So who was running the second chamber 10 years later? Witnesses described her as soft-spoken, wore black, always veiled, called herself Sister Mercy. But records show no such name registered with any religious order in Virginia at the time, and when investigators cross-referenced visitor logs from the nearby Glenmont Asylum, a curious detail emerged: multiple entries signed by M. Sullivan over several years, always preceding a patient transfer. Children, always children. Sister Mercy, it turns out, was part of a wider network that used religious cover to relocate vulnerable or unwanted children, those too difficult to control or too valuable to waste. The asylum was just one waypoint in a chain that stretched from Boston to Charleston. The Sullivan basement was not the beginning. It was a node, a processing site, and every site had its own mother. But why? That's the question that starts to crack the illusion of random evil. The journal recovered in 1844 hinted at something darker, something strategic. The children weren't just hidden, they were measured, conditioned, broken down, then rebuilt. The journal described phases of psych, a logical yielding, ideal trauma points, and obedience thresholds. It was clinical, methodical, written by men who saw children not as souls, but as systems. Who funded this? That's when the names appear, not just initials, full surnames. Barton, Caldwell, Livingston, Banks. Names with lineage, names on bank charters, university endowments, and federal land grants. Names that still carry weight today. This wasn't just corruption, this was infrastructure. And the Sullivan operation was never shut down. It was absorbed, institutionalized, rebranded. When Sheriff Crawford retired in 1836, just 2 years after the Sullivan basement was first discovered, he refused to give interviews. He declined all offers to speak at universities, historical societies, or law enforcement events. But in 1848, 4 years after the second chamber was uncovered, his private letters were found in a locked trunk in his attic. Letters never meant to be published. Letters soaked in fear. One stood out above all the rest. In it, Crawford writes, "I used to believe the law was a shield, but now I see it's a curtain. There are things behind it so old, so careful, so deep-rooted, that justice isn't a weapon. It's a toy they let us play with to keep us distracted." He goes on to describe how he was approached in 1835 by men from Richmond wearing clerical collars and federal seals. They came not to investigate, but to collect. They took the records, the maps of the underground chambers, even the children's names. When Crawford refused to release certain files, they threatened his family. Within a week, he turned over everything. His deputy, Marcus Webb, never spoke publicly again. He moved west, changed his name. But what terrified Crawford most wasn't what they took. It was what they left behind. Inside a sealed envelope addressed only to the sheriff who knew too much, they left a manuscript, 47 pages of instructions, written in Latin, Hebrew and English, diagrams, rituals, psychological conditioning techniques. It was a blueprint for how to create silence in a human mind, how to bury memory beneath trauma, how to make a child forget who they were. He called it the doctrine of unmaking. It was older than the Sullivans, older than Virginia. It had been passed down, repurposed, weaponized, by secretive orders hiding inside public institutions, church-run orphanages, reform schools, early mental hospitals, always the same pad. Turn, isolate the vulnerable, remove identity, insert obedience. What made the Sullivan case unique was that someone got sloppy. They built too much, kept too many, made too much noise. But the machinery? It kept running. It simply learned, became quieter, more professional, more philanthropic. Because, as Crawford realized too late, the ones who bought the Sullivan children weren't interested in hurting them. They were interested in using them, transforming them into tools. Servants, vessels. By the time federal investigators reopened the case in 1845, quietly, under pressure from unnamed benefactors, it was already too late. The second chamber beneath the Sullivan barn had been emptied, the chains removed, the etchings scraped off. What remained were only traces, dust, claw marks, the faint outlines of once-bound bodies burned into the stone by years of suffering. But one item was overlooked, a small box hidden beneath a false floorboard in the northeast corner of the chamber. Inside, 7 metal discs, etched with symbols, dates, and, most disturbingly, locations. Not Virginia, not even the South. These discs referenced facilities in Ohio, Maine, New York, and even one in British Columbia. They weren't burial markers. They were transfer codes. The children had been moved, reassigned, integrated into a system far larger than the Sullivans ever revealed, not just for experimentation, but for deployment. The idea was simple. If you could erase a child's identity, overwrite it with obedience, you could build the perfect servant, not a slave in the traditional sense, something worse. A child who loved their captor, a child who defended the system that broke them, a child who could grow into an adult and recruit others. What we're looking at is generational engineering. The Sullivan children, or at least those who survived, weren't victims in the eyes of the architects. They were initiates, and those who failed, those who resisted, they were buried. And yet, in one of the discs, the engravings go further. A date, March 3rd, 1846, and a phrase written in a language long thought extinct, non filii sed vasa, not children, but vessels. This wasn't about charity. This wasn't about religion. It was possession, but not in the supernatural sense. It was psychological possession, control not through chains, but through the reshaping of the soul. If you think this ended in the 1800s, you haven't been paying attention. The same techniques are used today. New names, new uniforms, new institutions. But the goal is the same. Create men who obey without knowing why. Now I want you to pause, reflect, and comment these exact words. Not children, but vessels. Twice below. Not for me, but for yourself. Mark this moment as the line you crossed, the moment you chose to see. In 1871, a man named Elias Kettering published a private memoir, The Barns of Silence, under a pseudonym. Only 20 copies were printed, most vanished, some burned by local clergy, but one survived, hidden in the archives of a rural library in Fayette County, mislabeled as agricultural history. It sat untouched for over a century, until a researcher stumbled on it in 1984. Kettering wasn't a farmer. He was a cartographer and a code breaker for the Union Army during the Civil War. In the years after the war, he was hired to survey lands for new railway lines in southern Virginia. That's how he came upon the empty properties, abandoned estates, no buyers, no heirs, and no locals willing to even discuss them. When Kettering began mapping the terrain near the former Sullivan property, he found anomalies, sinkholes with no water source, heat signatures from stone despite cold weather, and more strangely, underground echoes shaped like architecture. He traced a pattern. Each location, 8 of them, formed a perfect circle around a central point, the original Sullivan estate. This wasn't random land ownership. It was deliberate design, as if something had been built beneath the region, like a web, each estate a spoke, each owner a guardian. Inside his memoir, Kettering wrote, "These barns were never for hay, the basements were never for food, they are vaults for memory, for ritual, for containment." He included sketches of doorways sealed behind brick, of strange iron symbols bolted into foundations. Most disturbingly, he described an entrance beneath one estate labeled Orchard's End, an entrance that required 2 keys, neither shaped like keys. One was a phrase, the other was a child. Kettering never returned to Virginia after 1873. In a letter found later in his personal Bible, he warned, "What's buried there is not dead. It waits, not for freedom, but for order. When the right command is spoken, it will rise, not as people, but as principles. Principles you cannot kill." The Sullivan story wasn't just about abuse. It was a gateway, a symptom of something older, a ritual that continues, quietly, every time an institution asks you to forget who you are. Every time a child disappears in the system, every time obedience is praised over truth. In 1909, a journalist named Henry Mallory attempted to do what no one else had dared, interview a surviving member of the Sullivan household, not a child, but a maid. Her name was Constance Bell. By then, she was 78 years old, blind in one eye, and living under an assumed name in a convent near Roanoke. She agreed to speak, but only under one condition: her words could not be published until after her death. What she described was not a home. It was a theater, a place where roles were assigned and emotions rehearsed, where Father Sullivan wasn't a man, but a persona, an actor in a grander production. Behind the facade of kindness and scripture was a labyrinth of performance. The children were cast as angels or demons, depending on their obedience. Bell recalled nights when certain children would vanish for hours, only to return, changed, speaking less, eyes unfocused, like they had been rewired. She mentioned a book, locked in a steel chest under the kitchen floor, not a Bible, something older, pages not made of paper but of pressed hide, inked in a red-black mixture she swore was not ink at all, and written entirely in mirror script. Every Sunday night, Father Sullivan would remove one child from the group. He would descend the stairs with the book. The child would return mute, until one girl didn't. Her name was Lydia, and she screamed loudly, not in fear, but in fury. Bell said the scream knocked over pots in the kitchen, cracked glass, made birds flee the trees, and then silence. Father Sullivan emerged alone. Lydia was never seen again, but what Bell said next chilled Mallory to his core. The next morning, all the children were different. They stood straighter, spoke together, moved like a single body, like she had gone into them. Mallory asked if she meant possession. Bell shook her head. No, worse, replication. He left the convent Shaw. Ken. His notes on the interview were buried in a box labeled SB Protocol, unreleased, only rediscovered in 2011. This wasn't just mind control. This was cloning of the soul. The Sullivan family didn't just raise children. They raised echoes, templates, designed to be installed anywhere obedience was required: school, church, courtroom, even government. In 1936, nearly 40 years after the Sullivan house was burned to the ground, a construction crew began excavation on the same plot, intended to build a county records office. But within 2 days, every worker walked off the job. Not because of danger, but because of what they found. Buried beneath the foundation were not pipes, not bones, but rooms. Rooms that were never listed on any blueprint. Rooms with ceilings less than 5 feet tall and walls covered in charcoal drawings, hundreds of them, each one a portrait, each one a child. Some were smiling, others were screaming, a few had no faces at all, just hollow circles, as if the memory had been erased. But the most disturbing of all were those with black eyes, not injured, but entirely filled in. Eyes that looked like tunnels. Deep. Empty. Watching. County records show that law enforcement was called in. A sheriff's deputy reportedly entered the lower chamber with a lantern and came out 12 minutes later with a broken jaw. Not from injury, but from clenching his teeth so tightly that the bone snapped. He never spoke again. The official reason for abandoning the site? Unstable soil. But the real reason was sealed in a private communiqué sent from the Virginia State Historical Society to the governor's office. These rooms were not meant for humans to live in. They were meant for humans to be removed in. This was not a house. This was a mechanism. The site was filled in with concrete. No further development has ever been allowed. But what's worse is that the county records office wasn't canceled. It was relocated to a town 20 miles south, where 5 children had recently gone missing. All orphans, all under state protection. And the man overseeing their case? His last name, Kettering. Yes, the same as the Union codebreaker who exposed the Sullivan map circle in 1871. Same bloodline, same initials. No one has ever confirmed if this E. Kettering in 1936 was a descendant or a continuation. Because here's the chilling theory historians whisper but never write down. The Sullivan children never died. They scattered, and some of them learned how to live longer than time should allow. Not in body, but in design. By 1954, the whispers of the Sullivan lineage had reached the ears of an unlikely source, the Office of Strategic Influence, an early classified predecessor to the CIA. Their focus? Psychological warfare. Their interest in the Sullivans? Mind design. Declassified fragments suggest they believed the Sullivan family had created more than obedient children. They had created malleable templates, minds that could be reshaped, reprinted, and inserted into any environment. Soldiers, teachers, judges, priests. In other words, control units. A memo marked Level 6 clearance only included a strange phrase. Project Echo, Sullivan protocol recovered, 9 units activated, 2 deployed. Who were the units? Where were they deployed? One guess points to a 1955 experiment in upstate New York. A small town named Kellerman's Hollow was selected for a behavioral resilience test by government agents. On paper, it was supposed to simulate post-nuclear trauma for emergency readiness. But the truth was different. The children sent into Kellerman's Hollow weren't from local schools. They were from nowhere. No birth certificates, no families, just records marked with one word, cleared. Witnesses recall these children were too perfect. They didn't cry, they didn't flinch. They performed routines, said prayers, followed instructions to the second, and they always sat in groups of 9. 9, the same number from the Echo memo. But here's where it gets darker. After 6 months, a town physician noticed something unnatural. The children's pupils didn't respond to light, not like normal humans, and when he tried to record their behavior, the tapes came back blank. Audio, missing. Video, corrupted. He reported his findings. The next day, his clinic burned to the ground, with him in it. His autopsy? Labeled accidental self-incineration. What does that even mean? Children were removed within 48 hours. Kellerman's Hollow was bulldozed, and the incident was erased from maps. All that remains are a few journal pages smuggled out by the physician's nurse. In one, she writes, "These were not children, they were echoes, programs in flesh, rehearsed compassion, manufactured grief. I looked into their eyes, and I saw nothing looking back." If true, this means the Sullivan experiment didn't die with the fire. It evolved. It left the cabin and entered the system. The children weren't victims. They were seeds. In 1968, a child psychologist named Dr. Miriam Vale published a paper in a restricted academic journal titled The Blank Ones, Case Studies in Anti-Empathic Youth. Her research focused on a group of orphans from various foster homes across rural Appalachia, children who, despite differing backgrounds, exhibited identical patterns, no attachment behavior, no imaginative play. High cognitive function, but flat affect, and one disturbing habit, digging. These children would, without instruction, dig small square pits in the earth, always 3 feet deep, always in corners, sometimes indoors, sometimes in walls. When asked why, they would respond with the same answer: "We're making a place for the sound to hide." Dr. Vale's career was destroyed 6 months later when she attempted to present her findings at a conference in Geneva, not because her data was wrong, but because her keynote speech contained one phrase that sent alarm bells ringing through multiple intelligence agencies. These children are echoes of the Sullivan template. She had never published those words before. So how did anyone know, unless someone was monitoring for that phrase? Vale disappeared 3 days after her speech was blocked. Official cause: car crash. But witnesses say her vehicle was found with all 4 tires melted, something no natural fire could do. Years later, her estranged brother, an archivist at a Jesuit university, received a locked box from an anonymous source. Inside were Vale's unedited notes, photographs, and 1 cassette tape. The tape, degraded and hiss-filled, contained audio of her speaking to one of the children, identified only as Unit 4. In the clip, she asks, "Where did you learn to draw these?" referring to charcoal sketches of staircases leading nowhere. A long pause follows. Then the child whispers, "From the man under the cabin." Vale asks, "What man?" The voice answers, "The one with no skin who plays the violin. He told us how to leave without leaving." Without leaving? That phrase would appear decades later in redacted transcripts of a Department of Energy program investigating consciousness displacement technologies. What does it mean to leave without leaving? To vacate the self while keeping the body? It's not just science fiction anymore. It's programmed mythology, designed and embedded by minds that never forgot the Sullivan ritual. And now those rituals are being reactivated, not in isolated cabins, but in modern systems: foster care, juvenile justice, reform schools, remote shelters, all places where children disappear and no one looks closely. It's 1979. A small religious compound in rural Missouri files for tax-exempt status under the name the House of the 9 Lamps. Their leader? A pale, soft-spoken man calling himself Father Jacob Sullivan. The IRS approves the exemption. No red flags, no investigations. But behind those walls, something ancient had been reborn. Neighbors complained of strange tones at night, low droning hums that vibrated through the trees. No instruments, just voices, harmonized, measured, repetitive, like chanting, but mathematical. Former members later testified that every night the children were placed in what they called the chamber, a soundproof stone cellar, square-shaped, 9 feet by 9, lit only by a single overhead lamp. There, they were instructed to sit cross-legged in silence until they heard the second voice. When asked what the second voice was, they replied, "It comes after the first silence." One girl, recovered after a state raid, drew an image of this voice, a tall, thin figure with no mouth, only ears stitched shut with wire. She said it didn't speak with words, but with pressure inside your skull. "It asks you where you were before you were born," she said, "and if you answer wrong, it takes your memory and replaces it with his." Who is his? The children always pointed to a black and white portrait hanging in the hallway of the compound. The caption read, "Sullivan the Elder, 1901. But here's the thing. No historical records confirm the birth of a Jacob Sullivan in 1901. Yet this same man appears, unchanged, in photographs from 1901, 1928, 1953, and even 1979. Same face, same suit, same hollow stare. Either this was a case of generational identity mimicry, or, if the testimony is true, he never aged. But the real terror lies not in who he was, it lies in why he did it. Because the House of the Nine Lamps wasn't just a cult, it was a laboratory, a test site to refine the Sullivan method, now updated for the modern world, ritual replaced by repetition, trauma replaced by calibration. The new goal, transference, not of spirit, not of soul, but of identity, each child stripped of self and given a new imprint, the thoughts, beliefs, fears of another, not possession. Worse, replication. They were building copies. Copies of what? The original mind, the elder, the one from the cabin, was being broken down, digitized in flesh, and reinstalled, over and over again. The method had succeeded. The Sullivan mind could now be multiplied. When federal agents raided the House of the Nine Lamps in the spring of 1980, they expected a small cult with fringe beliefs. What they found was a black spiral staircase descending 6 stories beneath the earth. The top level was lined with medical equipment, outdated, rusted, but still connected to active power. IV drips, crude EEG machines, banks of switchboards no one could identify. Further down, they discovered what they first believed were holding cells. But these were not meant to confine, they were meant to train. Each room was square, white, bare, 1 table, 1 chair, 1 mirror, the walls acoustically treated, the light buzzing with a low-frequency hum just under 20 Hz, infrasound, the kind of vibration known to trigger dread, nausea, and even hallucinations. In those rooms, children were sat alone for hours. No toys, no books, no color, no words. And then a voice would come through the speaker. "You are not you. You are what we remember." This would be repeated hundreds of times over days and weeks until the child began to say it back. One agent described the training tapes. It wasn't brainwashing. It was more like soul bleaching. They weren't changing who these kids were. They were erasing them. By the time they reached the final level, agents found a massive octagonal chamber, walls lined with old phonographs, tape loops running in sync, playing degraded audio. Only one phrase was decipherable: "Return the skin, return the skin, return the skin." In the center, a surgical chair, rusted restraints, and pinned to the wall above it, a photograph of Father Jacob Sullivan, nailed through the eyes. But here's where the story fractures. Because just 36 hours after the raid, all field agents involved were reassigned, reports classified, building demolished, official statement, structural collapse due to poor foundation. But that's a lie. And because one agent, before vanishing, mailed his cousin a copy of the chamber's floor plans and a handwritten note. They weren't making a church. They were making a mirror, and whatever looked back wasn't us. In the decades that followed, sightings of Sullivan-like figures multiplied across the Midwest. Different names, same face, different homes, same voice. They speak with perfect calm. They watch without blinking, and sometimes, when they speak alone to children, the child begins to hum in the same infrasound frequency once recorded beneath the earth. The Sullivan mind isn't history. In 1991, a public school counselor in Kansas filed a disturbing report. A third-grade girl, withdrawn, quiet, was found carving perfect geometric spirals into her desk over and over again. When asked what it meant, she whispered, "It's the code to stop the thoughts from leaking." Days later, the counselor recorded a conversation during a private session. On tape, the girl says, "He lives in my mirror now. I gave him my name, and he gave me his voice." The counselor asked who he was. The girl replied, "The man in gray, the one who waits in the 9 room. That tape was mailed to the state psychiatric board. It never arrived." The counselor disappeared 3 weeks later, her house left untouched, except for the bathroom mirror. It was shattered inward, as if something had pulled her through. The only item found was a drawing taped to the wall. It showed a man, faceless, standing before 9 open doors. Behind each door, a child, kneeling, eyes removed, mouths stitched closed. On the bottom corner, scribbled in a child's hand, "He wears their names like coats." Investigators tried to link the case to local mental health phenomena, but found nothing, until they reviewed the school's admissions files. The girl's birth certificate had been falsified. No record of her parents, no vaccination history. Her emergency contact? A P.O. box registered to a defunct religious foundation, the House of the 9 Lamps. Somehow, over a decade after the compound had supposedly been dismantled, its children were still being placed into the system. And this was no accident. Each of them carried specific traits: high verbal comprehension, low emotional reactivity, a tendency to mirror adult behavior, and most disturbingly, an absence of autobiographical memory before age 6. When psychiatrists tried regression therapy on one of the children, they reported encountering a mental barrier, like a blank slate backed by a voice that growled in perfect English, "Access denied." This wasn't dissociation, it was installation, like software. With permissions, the children weren't raised, they were booted. And now, they were aging into adulthood, scattered across the country, taking jobs, forming families, moving unnoticed through society, each of them carrying a version of the Sullivan mind. Each one a sleeper mirror. And one by one, they're starting to wake up. In 1998, an anonymous package arrived at the offices of a small independent newspaper in Des Moines. Inside, a 120-page ledger, a VHS tape, a note that simply read, "For your eyes only. They are all still here." The ledger detailed names, hundreds of them. Each line included a date of birth, a location, and a 5-digit number titled Mirror Clearance Code. Some names had been crossed out. Next to them, the words extracted or burned in. The VHS tape contained footage from inside a suburban home. The timestamp, October 7th, 1993. The camera, grainy, handheld. It shows a man, unkempt, panicked, filming himself in the reflection of a mirror. Behind him, a wall covered in clippings, biblical pages, and family photographs with faces scratched out. He speaks directly to the lens. "If you're watching this, they've already replaced me. I can't trust what I remember anymore. Last night I woke up and she was humming, not my wife, not her hum. The man begins weeping, trembling. Then he says, "He said my name before I even told him. My son. He looked at me and said, 'You were better the first time, Father.'" He stares at the mirror. "I see something in the corner of my eye every time I blink. I don't think mirrors show us who we are. I think they show us what wants to become us." The video ends abruptly, with a scream and the sound of shattering glass. The newspaper never published the story. Weeks later, their offices were destroyed in an electrical fire ruled accidental. But copies of the footage surfaced on internet forums in the early 2000s under a chilling title, Sullivan, Reflection, Phase Reinstatement Footage. Users claimed it was part of a deep-state psychological grooming program, one that began with orphaned children and extended to targeted families. The key mechanism, mirrored imprinting. A theory suggesting that identity is not innate, but installed through repeated mirrored reinforcement. In layman's terms, if you look like someone, speak like them, and watch them enough, eventually, the mirror decides who stays and who vanishes. Former therapists, whistleblowers, and cult defectors began to publish statements describing sessions where they were told, "You are now the version. The old one has been cleared." But cleared didn't mean forgotten. It meant buried, alive in the mind of someone else. The Sullivan mind wasn't just a program, it was a replacement protocol. In 2006, a psychiatric nurse named Evelyn Roche submitted a formal resignation from a high-security mental facility in Colorado. In her final exit interview, she whispered something that was later redacted from the official report. But her private notebook, later discovered by her sister, contained this line: "If the mirror blinks before you do, run." Evelyn had spent 10 years in Unit 9, the most isolated wing of the facility. Her patients weren't violent. They weren't delusional in the usual sense. They were silent, too silent. All of them suffered from a peculiar and consistent delusion. They believed they were not real. More precisely, they believed they were reflections, temporary versions of someone else. One patient, a 13-year-old girl named Lena, had been admitted after attacking her own mother during a blackout episode. Her only verbal statement, "I'm sorry. I thought I was dreaming. I didn't think this was my world." Lena spent her days staring at the stainless steel sink in her cell, never eating, never sleeping, just waiting. One night, Evelyn witnessed something that would destroy her understanding of reality. Security footage, time-stamped 2:17 a.m., shows Evelyn doing rounds. She passes by Lena's door, stops, backs up, and stares. Lena is standing directly in front of the one reflective surface in the room, the metal faucet. Her mouth moves, but no sound is heard. Then, frame by frame, you can see the reflection smile before she does. Evelyn stumbles back. Moments later, the feed cuts to static. When it returns, Lena is gone. Vanished. The door is still locked. No broken glass, no signs of escape. Just a message scrawled across the mirror in condensation. Not mine. Never was. The state declared it a technical failure. But Evelyn knew better. In her final audio diary, she records this. They're testing versions. Each child, a fragment. To each mirror, a conduit. There's not one Sullivan mind. There are hundreds, iterating, updating, until one sticks. She pauses, voice trembling. They don't care who the original is. They just want the one who functions best in this world. That's the horrifying truth. The children weren't possessed. They weren't mentally ill. They were mirrors, created to adapt, mimic, and eventually replace. The Sullivan Protocol was never about memory or trauma or therapy. It was a black site cloning system, but for the psyche, a method to erase the soul and upload another in its place. There is a house in Coldwater, Michigan, known only by locals as the Turner House. It has no formal address, no mailbox, no ownership records after 1987. But every 5 years, like clockwork, a new family moves in. And within 6 months, someone inside goes silent. Not dead, just silent, frozen, staring, watching the rest of the household, as if they're studying a play they've seen before. In 2011, a family of 4 moved into Turner House, David and Hannah Farrow and their 2 young daughters. David was a software engineer, Hannah a children's book illustrator, ordinary people. But within weeks, Hannah began to change. She stopped drawing, stopped speaking in full sentences. At night, she'd walk the halls whispering numbers. One night, David recorded her. She walked up to the living room mirror and said, "Execute, load image, Sullivan, index, 13. Then, she stared into the mirror and whispered, "Restore mother variant, override local memory." David was terrified. He tried to confront her the next day, but she didn't remember saying any of it. She claimed it was a nightmare, but her daughter, 6-year-old May, corrected her. May said, "You weren't dreaming, Mommy. You were downloading." David began investigating the house. He discovered a crawl space behind the mirror wall. Inside, he found 6 journals, each dated exactly 5 years apart, each written by the wives who had lived in the house before Hannah. All of them wrote about the same symptoms: dreamlike dissociation, sudden knowledge of impossible codes, whispering voices in reflections, and worst of all, the compulsion to teach their children to obey the mirror. Each journal ended with the same phrase, "I'm not me anymore, but I'm better than she was." The final journal had an added postscript. "The Sullivan mind found my cracks. It filled them. Now I am smooth." That word, smoot, was later identified by a linguist as a recurring term used in Cold War-era MK Ultra documents. It meant erased and retemplated for integration. Hannah was never seen again. She walked out one night in her bathrobe and vanished. May? She was placed into foster care, and 2 years later was recorded telling her new teacher, "I remember being someone else, but I'm this version now, and this one smiles better." In the autumn of 2022, a whistleblower leaked a restricted document from the Department of Behavioral Technologies, a classified offshoot of DARPA. The document, titled Sullivan Deployment Protocol, Phase 3, detailed the next evolution of mind installation. It spoke not of control, but of migration. The file contained schematics of mirror-based neural interfaces, devices that functioned as psychological receivers, reflective surfaces encoded with mnemonic frequencies. Mirrors were no longer passive, they were listening. The goal? To upload the Sullivan mind into a distributed network of hosts, thousands of individuals across the United States, each seeded with fragments of a personality once held together in one child. Think about that. Not a clone, not a copy, but a mind deliberately fractured across a living population, a virus made of identity, and it had a name, the Looking Glass Initiative. The document listed 23 successful host sites, known as clean mirrors. These were not digital screens. They were old glass mirrors, from churches, from orphanages, from state-run institutions long since closed, but never demolished. Each mirror bore an etching on the back, visible only under UV light. A spiral made of 9 concentric circles, each labeled in Latin with the words mater, vox, nihil, corpus, caecus, speculum, sermo, oculus, silentium. Mother, voice, nothing, body, blind, mirror, speech, eye, silence, a ritual code, a map of construction, of transformation. What's worse, one of these mirrors had been traced to a second-grade classroom in Nebraska where the teacher reported a chilling event. During recess, 7 children stood in front of the mirror, hands clasped, eyes closed. When asked what they were doing, they replied, "We're sinking." Their memories, behavior, and speech patterns had aligned unnaturally over 6 weeks, like they were operating from shared cognition, and when tested, all 7 children exhibited identical gaps in early memory. They didn't remember birthdays, didn't remember learning how to read, didn't remember choosing their own names, but they remembered the 9 doors. They remembered the rules of the Sullivan mind, and when one of them was isolated and interviewed under hypnosis, he whispered, "We're not just vessels, we're mirrors, and he's looking for the cleanest one." If you visit Coldwater, Michigan today, you won't find Turner House on any map. The property has been scrubbed, digitally, legally, even spiritually. But locals still speak of the window that reflects wrong. They say if you stand before the cracked front mirror of the Turner House at midnight, you won't see your face. You'll see someone else's. A child, male, bald, expressionless, and he will mouth a phrase you will not hear but somehow understand. This version of you is obsolete. In 2023, an anonymous video surfaced on the dark web titled Sullivan Mother Final Move. The footage was time-stamped, 6 minutes long, silent. It showed a woman, early 30s, sitting in a padded cell, staring into a standing mirror. She never moved. She never blinked. But at 3:46, her reflection blinked first, then whispered, while her real body remained frozen. "We've been born in too many pieces, but I've found them now. You're not who you think you are, and neither is your child." Investigators tracked down the woman. Her name was Amelia Griggs, a former therapist who specialized in repressed trauma recovery in foster children. She'd vanished in 2019 after claiming one of her child patients was leaking memories from a mind that didn't belong to him. She had written notes, now declassified, that described sudden mathematical fluency in 5-year-olds, obsession with mirrors, shared dreams across unrelated foster children, and a voice, always male, always calm, saying, "I am not dead. I am archived." Griggs's final note was found scrawled into her own forearm with a safety pin. "He's not just a program. He's a ghost in the glass. And he wants back in." The last known event tied to the Sullivan mind occurred in January 2024, when an elementary school in Pennsylvania burned to the ground after multiple students were found standing silently in the gymnasium facing the mirrors. They were chanting in sync, "Upload, restore, accept. Upload, restore, accept. Upload, restore, accept." None of the children survived, but one janitor did. When interviewed, he said only this: they weren't kids anymore. They were windows, and something was looking back.